Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my end of the season deep dive series where I dive into each team and compare them around the constructor standings where they finished in that constructor standings around the other teams in that same area. And I will go into the drivers of that team and then compare them with the drivers championship around the drivers where they finished in that championship. So it kind of give you an idea of roughly how well they did with the, team and drivers around them in those championships. Today we'll be diving into the Racing Bulls team, where they finished right at that midpoint, in the constructor standings. If you're looking for more information on one of these lower teams, you feel free to peruse my videos as you'll find those deep dives there. Now, if you're looking for the top half of the grid, you will have to wait for those videos to come out. But today we will be diving into Racing Bulls, as I said. And why did Racing Bulls finish in that halfway point? Basically, they moved up from 8th place to 6th place this year. And so they're right at that cusp of, that halfway point in this, constructor standings. And how did they get there? Well, basically they got there because Hadjar performed, dramatically better than I think most people thought he would. He kind of came out of the box as a rookie and really performed quite well in this season. Yes, he had a couple of mistakes, of course, as you would expect a rookie to have, but he's learning from those mistakes, and he's really harsh on himself in that regard and trying to better his driving standards in that Racing Bulls. They also had a little bit of drivers mix-up, when they were switching out Yuki and Lawson early on in the season, which kind of helped push them back a little bit farther than they should have been, maybe, due to that transition of those drivers and helping them, like Lawson, get back into familiarity with the Racing Bulls and kind of get him back into that team and that car to see where he could line up with his skills. Now, of course, the Racing Bulls had a nice, better connection than normally with the Racing Bull team as of last year. The previous year, they were a little bit less conjoined with that Red Bulls team. They weren't quite taking on as many parts and schedules and stuff to that effect. And so this year they were a little bit tighter in that sharing of the parts and things that they could get from their parent team, which helped them a little bit more, I think, in this regard in this season to have a little bit more consistent drive and a little bit better car in general to get them up into that midpoint of the field. So we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more details with the drivers and the teams and those graphs, but just to give you some little highlights here, we can see that Hadjar, out sprint qualified Lawson 5 out of 5 times and outperformed, Lawson in the sprint races 4 out of 5 times. So he was quite heavily outdoing his teammate in those sprint qualifyings and sprint races. Now, if you go jump down to the full GP races where all the points or most of the points are residing, you can see that he out qualified Lawson 15 out of 22 times. So not quite the ratio as at the sprint races, but still a good amount that he, over half that he actually out qualified his teammate in those GP races. And that kind of performed the same way in the finishing point for those GP races where he was 15 out of 22 times that he finished ahead of Lawson in those GP races. Now, if you don't want to do the math, we'll just jump into Lawson. So Lawson out sprint qualified Hadjar 0 out of 5 times, and he performed Hadjar in those sprint races 1 out of 5 times. So he won to those 5 times that was able to finish in that sprint race than his teammate. Now, if you look at the GP races, he outqualified Hadjar 7 out of the 22 times that they raced compared with each other in that same vehicle, and he outperformed and finished in that GP race ahead of his teammate 7 out of 22 times as well. So only 7 out of those 24 races did Lawson actually make it up into ahead of his teammate Hadjar. Here we have a nice little chart for the Racing Bulls team and the drivers, giving you a little bit of idea how well they did this season. So as I said earlier, they moved up from 8th place from last year up to the 6th place this year in the constructor standing. So they kind of did a 2-place movement in that progress. So that was really good to see. Now, can they move that forward into the new regulations of next year? We'll have to wait and see if that plays through, or if they drop back down into the bottom portion of the constructors. Now, on average, they had a 12.2 average sprint qualifying position. And for the average sprint races, they moved up to a 9.4. So they actually gained places in the sprint races on average, which is really good to see for them, as they were actually moving up into that range just outside those points for those sprint races. So they weren't quite getting points every week that those sprint races were happening, but they were getting up there where they could actually poke and get into those points on occasion. Now you move into the GP races, and they averaged a 9.5 qualifying position for the GP races. So right at the edge of those point markers for the GP races, but they finished down a little bit, down to that 12.8 position for those races. So they dropped back a couple of positions. So that's not quite as well as they should have done. So they're getting their qualifying sessions really good. And they just need to, convert those over to the GP finishes so that they can get into those points on an average basis. So they were dropping out a little bit more than they should be, in my viewpoint. Now they had 0 DNFs in the sprint races and 7 in the GP races. So if we break that down to each driver, so we have Isaac Hadjar, who of course he wasn't here last year. So in the standings for 2025, he is at 12th. His average sprint qualifying was 10.8, so a little bit farther back, not quite into the points, but still pretty decent in that spot, able to potentially make it up there into those point markers. And his average finishing GP position was 10.3, so just a tad bit improvement there, but not quite where he needed to be to get points on average. Now his GP races, he was at 9.8 starting position. So that's really good to see right at that bottom part of the points. And his average finishing position was 11.8. So dropped down about a position or two in those GP races. It's probably because of his, being a rookie, not quite knowing the tracks and getting, the cars taken advantage of every opportunity. Probably wasn't quite as well attuned, even though he's doing really well in that Racing Bulls. And so I expect to be a little bit better in this regard, as he knows some of those tracks. Now we have a new car next year, so we'll have to see how that performs overall. And he had 3 of those DNFs in those GP races. Now you compare him to his teammate, Liam Lawson, who was finished off in 21st position last year, as he subbed a couple of drivers last year. And this year he moved up to that 14th marker. So not quite where his teammate was, but still a pretty good spot for him on that driver's standings. His average sprint qualifying was 14.6, and he moved up to at 11.8 on those finishing sprint races. So he's moving up quite a bit in those sprint races, but of course not quite on average into those points, still a few positions back behind those points for those sprint races. So we'll have to see how that plays out in the future, if he can learn from that and get more ground in that process. Now for the GP races, he started in an average of 11.7, and he dropped down basically a position in those races on average to a 12.7. So he's losing some positions there. So again, they're doing really good in those qualifying sessions. They just need to figure out how to convert those over to those race finishing positions to get them a little bit more average on near those points, so they can get those points when other things happen and take advantage of those. And he had 4 of those DNFs in those GP races. And here we're comparing the Racing Bulls team members against themselves in those sprint races, and kind of where they finished in those sprint races. And so you can throw Yuki in here, it's just he had 1 of those sprint races, just to give you an idea where he lined up in that as well. But the main point here is the comparison between Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson in those sprint races. As you can see, that downward trend, because that's the bottom of the marker, would be the top positions. And so the farther down you are, and the trend lines, if you're going down, is better to see this as they're getting better throughout the season. If that trend line is going down, if it's going up, that means they're getting worse throughout the season. As you can see with Liam Lawson, he started off decently, but kind of got worse in those sprint races as the season went on. So he wasn't quite taking advantage of those sprint races with everybody else gaining ground in those improvements on their vehicles. He wasn't able to take full advantage of that Racing Bulls. Whereas Isaac Hadjar started off not so great with that 15th place on that sprint race, but was able to come back in Miami and keep it pretty steady around that 10th place marker for the most part, in that having his trend line go down throughout the season, which helped him out getting better throughout the season on average. Of course, he was just at the edge of getting points, not quite getting up there into that point marker on average, but still doing a decent job. And here we're doing a little bit closer look onto Isaac Hadjar's sprint races and comparing them to the drivers around him in the Drivers' Championship on how they performed in those same sprint races. So here we see Isaac Hadjar compared against Oliver Bearman and Nico Hülkenberg in those 6 sprint races, and you can kind of look at those markers to figure out how well that Isaac Hadjar was doing compared to those drivers around him, which you can see that Nico was getting quite better throughout this season on a more dynamic curve downwards, whereas his performance there, whereas Isaac Hadjar was still getting better, but not quite as fast as Nico Hülkenberg this season. When you see Oliver Bearman pretty steady around that 14th-ish position, pretty steady across the board, where he had that nice, good Belgium, result, but otherwise he was kind of lacking behind, Isaac Hadjar in those sprint races. And here we're doing the same thing with Liam Lawson in those same 6 sprint races and comparing the drivers around him in that regard. So we're comparing him against Esteban Ocon and Oliver Bearman as well. So we kind of look at this in that result. And you can see that Liam Lawson was getting worse throughout the season again, as the same thing kind of goes with Esteban Ocon, but not quite as steep of a downward trend that Lawson had, but still getting worse throughout the season. Where again, Oliver Bearman was pretty steady across the board on this season. So you kind of compare those and where they did well and where they did poorly. And you can see that, Belgium, it looks like the Haas team was doing a decent job there compared to the Racing Bulls, where they were fairly competitive in that regard from the rest of the other races, just kind of lagging behind, but keeping the same rough trend. And now we move over to the GP races, and so we're comparing the Racing Bull drivers in those GP races. So you can see those 2 races that Yuki had in that Racing Bulls, and then he jumped over to Liam Lawson, in that running. So you can kind of see those 3 drivers and kind of figure out roughly how they were. I mean, you can't pull out a lot of data from Yuki in that because they only had a couple of races there, but I just threw those in just for your information. But again, you can kind of compare Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson throughout the season and how Liam Lawson was getting a little bit better throughout the season, where Isaac Hadjar was getting slightly worse. So, I think Liam was getting more grips with that Racing Bulls as he jumped in at the beginning of the season, not quite at the preseason where he should have gotten some of that results in beforehand, but had to jump in a little bit later and is able to adapt eventually to that Racing Bulls and get a little bit more results, gaining some ground on Isaac Hadjar throughout this season. But of course, Isaac Hadjar was, outshined him for the most part in this. As you can see, that beginning part was, fairly dominant for Isaac Hadjar. And then we had a little bit of offs in the middle, and he kind of came back pretty strong in Netherlands, of course, in those races there. So you can kind of get an idea of how well those 2 teammates were comparing each other, as that should be the same car in those GP races. Again, we're diving in and looking a little bit closer into Isaac Hadjar in those GP races. So we're comparing the drivers around him in those drivers' standings. And so we're comparing him against Oliver Bearman and Nico Hülkenberg in this stance. So we can kind of look and figure out how well he performed there. And again, you see, Isaac Hadjar, we saw earlier, getting slightly worse throughout the season, but still pretty steady in that, 11th place marker on average, where we see, Nico Hülkenberg steadily there, but a little bit farther behind him. And then we see Oliver Bearman, starting off kind of worse than the 2, but getting better throughout the season as he kind of ended up near that 10th place marker on that trend line, which means he was getting better throughout the season, where he was taking grips on that Haas and getting better and kind of getting closer to, Isaac Hadjar in those finishing positions at the end of the season comparatively. So here you can kind of get a little bit of idea how that works in those races and kind of figure out what those cars are doing good at and bad at in the race by race basis. And so we dive into a little bit closer look on Liam Lawson here and see how he compares against Esteban Ocon and Oliver Behrman in those same driver standings around him. And so we're kind of looking at that aspect of it, and you can see that Liam Lawson was getting better, but not quite as fast as Oliver Behrman was, whereas Esteban Ocon was pretty steady in that regard. Now, of course, we missed the first two races with that Racing Bulls, so those are kind of blank there, and that's why he picks up in Japan and kind of gets to the marker there. And you can see some early on decent spots, but then he kind of became a little bit more erratic in those mid-season races, and then coming back a little bit better, but it's still pretty erratic near the end. But he was getting the grips of that, trying to push the limits of that Racing Bulls, getting a little bit more familiar and kind of helping him out, getting those positions at the end, growing a little bit more, just not quite finding the edge where he needs to be on that safety route, I think, in that regard. So here we're comparing the two team members of Racing Bulls in the point markers, since this is where they got their points on what race, and kind of looking at that all together for the season. And so you can kind of see those trend lines as Lawson was getting more points at the end of the season than he was at the beginning of the season, where Isaac Hadjar was pretty steady across the board, but they're still pretty both down there getting decent spots in that regard. But of course, this is the point marker, so this is the more points you gain, the higher those trend lines should be in that regard. And so you can kind of get an idea where they were and how they compared to each other in those races. And again, you can see that, Isaac Hadjar got higher points when he scored most of the time, but then there were some parts that Lawson was able to sneak out some points where Isaac Hadjar wasn't quite able to get into, which helped him out at the end of the season in this regard. And you kind of see this here in the step graph of that same data, as that Isaac Hadjar started off with points ahead of his teammate Liam Lawson, but where they kind of came in and got close, in Hungary, where he was able to really get to, just a small gap there before Isaac Hadjar, hit that big, point haul, and Netherlands. And then they were kind of coming back together near the end, but still had a pretty big gap at the end of the season in that regard. So you can kind of get an idea of how the ebb and flow went between those two teammates on those points in this season. Now we'll jump into more of the team aspect of it. So this is the team for Racing Bulls and their points in those sprint races compared to the Aston Martin and the Williams team in that regard for those sprint races. And you can kind of figure out where the teams relied on those sprint races and how well they got points in that regard. And of course, here you can see that the Racing Bulls was going down quite steeply in that regard, so they were not quite getting the points they needed at the end of the season on those sprint races, where both Aston Martin and Williams were gaining some ground in those sprint races at the end of the season, offsetting some of that, point markers in that regard. And this is that same information for points in those sprint races for the team as a whole, and you kind of figure out how well they did in those sprint races if it was just the sprint races themselves. So you can see that, of course, Racing Bulls started off strong, but then Aston Martin kind of came back, overtook them. And then, of course, the Williams team came back in Austin and kind of jumped ahead of both of those teams in that regard and kind of stayed out ahead of the other two teams. And now as we dig into the GP races where the main point haul comes from in general for these seasons, you can kind of get an idea where those teams, scored their points and how well they did in the main, GP races, which is the main, aspect of this, field, and how they played out in those, GP races. As you can see, Williams had a nice steady or slightly downgrade of their points throughout the season, so they're going to get slightly worse as everybody was developing their cars in this season, and how that played out. Whereas Aston Martin and the Racing Bulls were getting upward momentum, and so that was kind of showing you how more points they were gaining through at the end of the season in those GP races compared to those teams around them. And this is that same information just in a step graph. So this is the points, race by race, and where they ended up in that constructor standings just for the GP races, of course. But this is kind of the play out. So you can kind of see that Williams, took the lead and stayed ahead for the most of the season, where it was more of a battle between the Racing Bulls and Aston Martin in where they were going to end up in those points for those GP races. And here we're going to combine the sprint races and the GP races for those teams and give you a little bit of glimpse at that data. And so you'll have to, figure out, what was the difference between this graph and just the GP graph, as we added those sprint race points in there, and those are like minor points. And so you have to look fairly carefully here, but the main point I can see here is that the Aston Martin and the Racing Bulls trend lines were kind of getting more unified as the end of the season, kind of getting closer together on that front, whereas Williams still was out ahead, even though they weren't quite gaining as much ground as those other teams throughout this season. And again, this is the step graph over that data, so those points that were earned throughout the season. And again, you see Williams still far out ahead, not really getting threatened by either of those teams, but you can kind of look at that in regards to see how well the Aston Martin and the Racing Bulls were, fighting it out in this season, to see who was going to end up ahead of the other one by the end of the season. This you can go back and compare with the GP graph and kind of figure out a little bit more of the ebbs and flows and how well those sprint races helped or hurt each of those teams. So if you like this kind of data and you like to more of this, then I would appreciate a subscribe, as I'll be diving into Williams next week and give you a little bit more detail on them. And if you made it this far, I'd also appreciate a like. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.